It's always amazing to see what people sue one another over. Never ceases to amaze me. Why they go to court and what issue is it that draws them to the court of law? Many a times it's based upon what I want. It's based upon my self-centeredness. And maybe I think that I'm going to get something out of this. Not always is it about justice, 2015 was no different. And I imagine 2016 won't be any different either. Let me give you just a few examples of what I'm talking about here. I'm actually just five of them. Most ridiculous court cases. I don't know, I could have gave you several. But I just chose five just to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about here. Number one is animal rights group sues on behalf of monkey for ownership of selfies. Who's really laughing? I agree with you. I totally agree with you. That's ridiculous. Number two, armed bank robber in California sues over injuries incurred while fleeing the scene. I'm serious. This is number three. 8-year-old New York boy is sued by aunt for careless hugs. Only in New York, right? Huh? Well, I got one for Pennsylvania too. Pennsylvania nursing student fails in course twice and sues the school for not helping with anxiety. Oh, poor baby. Nobody had any anxiety from me. Anyway, and then number five, we got to pick on Florida a little bit. Florida woman is suing FedEx for tripping over a package left at her front door. What are they trying to get out of this? It's just something that are they looking for a quick buck? Are they looking for? It's just mind-boggling. Yet we see the corruption that goes on in people's hearts and lives and the things that they want. But when it happens on the other side of the bench, when the court themselves is acting in the same way of wanting their own desires and self-centeredness, power, financial gain, that's really disheartening, isn't it? Well, that's exactly where we're heading this morning, is we're going to see truth on trial. We spent the last few weeks talking about the upper room situation. Remember, as Jesus was talking to the disciples and the things that were going on there and what he was setting them up for a lifelong pursuit of knowing him, abiding in him, loving other people. And then we talked about last week how Judas went out and betrayed Jesus. Ultimately, he hung himself. And now we move on from that point where Jesus is taken away from that little tiny section of the Mount of Olives called Golgotha, being taken away to be on trial by these religious authorities. And it's not going to be pretty. If you've got a weak stomach, it's probably, maybe next week will be worse than this week. So hang on. But this is what Jesus endured for us. As we think about these trials, there were actually 6 of them. This week we're only going to be talking about 3 of them. And these 3 trials are religious in their actual makeup. The very first trial that he is going to endure is going to be in the home of Annas. Annas was a former high priest. No longer is he a priest, but he is someone that still retains the title of high priest. Actually, he was the very first priest that was appointed by the newly formed Roman province. And so he would kind of set this system up in many ways to be the distorted, corrupt system that it was. He remained one of the most influential political and social individuals in his day. As a matter of fact, he had 5 sons who became high priests as well, but they only served their dad. He was so influential in the religious system. I like to view Annas as the godfather. He's the guy that really held the strings. And nothing happened unless the Godfather okayed it. Was that okay, Henry? I don't know. It sounded like a Godfather, right? A corrupt Godfather. Thank you. The Godfather of the religious system. That ought to tell you right now, it served as something that was very corrupt. Very corrupt. And yet Jesus would stand before one of the most corrupt of them all, Annas, in his own home. It wasn't going to be a very good situation, and of course it wasn't going to be anything legal. And we're going to see these three mistrials here this morning. Mistrial number 1 in Annas' home. A few things that I want to point out to you that shows you that it was a mistrial was, first of all, it was held at night, and the high priest did the questioning. Now, according to the Jewish Mishnah, that was not supposed to happen. This should have been thrown out immediately, but it didn't. Also, there were no witnesses, legitimate witnesses. They were required to have 2 or 3 witnesses. But in this trial, there was none. And Jesus endured this. And clearly the point of this trial was not to find the truth or a just verdict. And let me just share with you, if you want to turn there to John chapter 18, and verse 19 to 24, we see this very brief trial. And Jesus stands before Annas, and he begins to question him about the disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus clearly, he wasn't being a smart aleck, in which it may sound that way, but he was very truthful. In a very honest and sincere way, Jesus says to Annas, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in temples, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. And so Jesus is clearly, he wasn't hiding anything. He openly proclaimed the truth of God. But then in verse 22, when he has said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? And so clearly, Annas is one of those guys that, are you a high priest or aren't you a high priest? You're kind of walking the line here. And you use that whenever it is convenient for you. And clearly he was not the high priest, but yet he retained the title, and he was acting sort of like the high priest. And so you can clearly see that people are thinking that way, but he wasn't a high priest. Well, he's walking this line back and forth, and Jesus clearly tells them that this is, in so many words, that this is a mistrial. You don't have anybody to bear witness about what you're accusing me of. So then quickly, Annas, verse 24, he sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now he's going to have trial number 2, and again it's going to be a mistrial. But what's kind of sad is when people are not really seeking the truth, they're seeking something else. You see, that's exactly what was happening in these court trials. Plato said, we can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. And these religious people, they were exactly that. They were afraid of the light because what does the light do? It exposes the darkness, drives the darkness away, and they didn't want anything to do with that. They weren't quite comfortable with their religious system. It took them a while to develop it. And they were quite influential, quite powerful, and they could manipulate the Jewish population at will. We don't want your light, Jesus. We're not trying to discover the truth here, so let's just kind of sidestep that. All we are trying to do here is find a conviction that we can nail to you. Because we only have one thing in mind for you, Jesus, and that's death. And so that's what we see in these 3 trials this morning, is the only reason they were convening is not for truth, it was for a conviction to stick on to Jesus, and ultimately so that they could have a court case, a legitimate court case before the Romans, And the Romans will execute Jesus. You see, the Roman Empire, they kept that they reserved that privilege of execution for themselves. The Jewish people were not allowed to execute, though, even though that these religious people claimed that they found Jesus as being guilty. They weren't allowed to execute Jesus. Rome had to do that. The best they could do is stick a charge onto him, a conviction, in which would allow them to go before the Roman court, and the Roman court would execute him. So that was the only purpose for these 3 religious trials. Trial number 2, we go back to the book of Mark, chapter 14, and we see where this trial before Caiaphas is taking place. Once again, it's still not legitimate. It's not held in the council's meeting hall. No advocates for the accused, and it's still at night. You see, it's completely illegitimate trial. But yet here Jesus stands before Caiaphas, the high priest. They were looking for a conviction. If you want to turn there to Mark chapter 14. Mark chapter 14. And by the way, I don't have any of these texts up on the slide for you because I don't want you to fall asleep. And it's good for you to turn to the passage every once in a while, you know. Mark 14, verse 53. We see another interesting setting going on here before Caiaphas. The passage is between Mark 14:53 and verse 65. And what we see here in this mistrial is some witnesses, supposed witnesses, that are coming before Jesus. And they're going to be saying some things, and they're not even agreeing on what they're saying. Let me show to you what they're saying. Verse 56. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands. And yet, even about this testimony, did not agree. You see, this testimony of what they were saying, what they said here, was only half truth. Isn't that interesting how someone else did that same thing centuries before? Satan. Satan would take half truth and he would twist them to manipulate the very context of what was being said. Here they take this context and they distort it. What Jesus told them, that the temple was going to be destroyed, and he wasn't talking about the temple in which they were standing around. That temple, that Herod temple, in which took them many, many years to construct, beautiful temple that it was. And Jesus is going to destroy this? That sounds like a pretty strong threat. Who in the world but some rebel would destroy this beautiful temple? But yet Jesus was not referring to that temple. He was referring to his own temple. His body itself was going to be destroyed, and in 3 days it would rise again. And so here, once again, there's a distortment. There is a mistrial going on here. But then we see something interesting that happened. In verse 60, the high priest stands up, completely out of line, and he begins to question Jesus. The high priest, you're not supposed to do that, you know. Well, again, this is a mistrial, and everything goes out the window. And so the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. In verse 63, and the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witness do we have? What further witness do we need? We've got it right here. And so you heard the blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to strike him, saying to him, "Prophesy!" And the guards received him with blows. You see this setting that was going on here? Finally, the high priest was sitting there gathering his thoughts, and knowing these witnesses weren't really very effective, and he stood up and he took the show, and he stood in front of Jesus, and he was going to get a charge, and he was going to stick that charge on Jesus so that this conviction would stand before the Roman government. After Jesus answers, we see the impressive theatrics. It sounds like Caiaphas is a zealous man for the law, for holiness. Boy, here's a guy that is so passionate about being godly and about truth and about protecting the holiness of God. And look at the way he is showing himself in that way. And it really gets the crowd around them charged up. Did you see what was happening there? And they were getting all charged up, and they were even started to participate in beginning to spit on Jesus. And the emotion of the crowd was getting out of hand very quickly. The charge was blasphemy, and that was a charge they believed they could take before Rome. Why was that? Because Rome knew that in the grapevine there is said to be a Messiah that was going to come up through the Jewish genealogy. And that Messiah was going to take this nation and make it a nation like no other. And they were always on guard for this Messiah to show up. And here, this could be him. This could be the Messiah. After all, he said it. We all heard him say that he is the Messiah. He's the Son of God. We heard that. And so, with that charge, they were going to take that case before Rome. And of course, the intensity of the crowd began to get rather ugly. And then they begin to take him to the third mistrial. Daybreak is happening, is starting to come. The sun's starting to peek out through the trees. People were getting up from out of their beds and beginning to do life as they know it there in first century Jerusalem. And as they were stirring around, news was starting to circulate. Being the beginning of the Passover, they heard that there was somebody on trial. And he was going to be before the Sanhedrins first thing this morning. Who would ever do that? This was a holy time in which the Passover was beginning, and the Sanhedrins are gathering together to hear somebody. The charges being brought against. This has to be significant. Who is it? And they found out it was Jesus of Nazareth. Well, they heard about him for the last 2-3 years. And there was a lot of discussion about who Jesus is and about the things that he did. Is he the Son of God or not? Well, the Sanhedrin was going to entertain Jesus in the things that he did. And the charges that were being brought against him. How are they going to decide? And no doubt, people were starting to press in around the area where the Sanhedrin council were to meet. What was the purpose? It was a show. They already knew. They've been meeting all night and trying to drum up these charges against Jesus, and they skillfully put the pieces together that when daylight breaks, the Sanhedrin council would convene, and they would have all their garb on, and they would be in full array and taking their seats, and we were going to usher Jesus in, and we were going to bring up the charges, and this was going to look good and appropriate before the people. It was all a show that was completely staged. Luke chapter 22, verses 66 to 70, we have recorded for us this very short event. Luke chapter 22, 66 to 70. And as he stands before this council of elders, Jesus is going to be asked more questions. And one in particular, this question in verse 67, "Are you then the Christ? Tell us. Tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, will you not believe? And if I ask you, will you not answer? But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." In their mind, that he was guilty. And he actually testified himself against that blasphemy. And so, once again, there are no legitimate witnesses. There is no legal representation for Jesus. And now the conviction is set, and now the case would go to a Roman official who could execute Jesus. Surely Rome would execute this man that was trying to stir things up against the Roman government. They needed to take care of this Messiah, this person that claims to be a son of God or a Messiah or whoever he is. Surely that would be enough to convict him and to put him to death. And off he will go to Pilate. Next week we will pick it up from there. But this morning I want to just kind of put things in perspective of where we're at today. It's really hard for us in this 21st century American society to kind of place this, to kind of understand what was going on sometimes. And we've heard these stories, we've heard these events, we heard these things, and maybe we've heard good events and good way of expositioning this passage, and maybe some better than others, but yet we've heard these things before. But yet it's still difficult for us to understand this. The first century Jewish culture was kind of interesting, to say the least. And we wonder, how could they possibly be misled by these so-called religious officials? How could they fall behind these people and follow after them in what they were doing? That sounds ridiculous. As we just read, and as we will continue next week, we see the greatest injustice ever suffered with Jesus. There will be nobody on the face of this planet that will endure more injustice than Jesus. No one more innocent. And there's few people, especially in that first century culture, that was more corrupt than Annas and Caiaphas. They were terrible. And all they wanted was something for themselves. Power, authority, financial gain, the riches, the prestige of this world. And they were pursuing it. And here was somebody that was going to put a roadblock in it. He needs to go. And so Jesus was treated in the way that he was. And yet, as we think about this, how could this be? Here was the greatest man ever to walk this earth. Here was somebody completely innocent, not worthy of any of the things that he was facing. And yet he serves as our greatest example of injustice. In the face of godliness, in the face of injustice. And we think, how can that be? How could that possibly be? I didn't tell you. I kind of skipped a couple things in this whole event. John and Peter were watching. They were watching what was going on from a distance. And we didn't talk about Peter. Peter had some problems, and he had some denial issues. He mistreated Jesus too. But yet he was still watching some things going on there. And he watched his master as he endured some injustice treatment. He was enduring some beatings. He was enduring a lot of stuff that he should have never been there. But yet Jesus faced it all alone. Why? It was rather confusing probably to Peter, but yet over the next decades, Peter would face the same type of persecution. Facing this persecution against injustice. People that really didn't like God and didn't like anyone that was pursuing after Christ. And Peter would face that throughout his life hereafter. And then Peter himself, he had to be on the other side of things and watch his friends, his brothers and sisters in Christ endure suffering. And he served as a type of person that was going to encourage them. As someone that has seen the greatest injustice with Jesus, Peter himself would endure injustice, and now he would try to encourage those that were facing injustice. The book of 1 Peter is written to those people that were enduring suffering. And Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20, this message. For what credit is it if you sin and are beaten for it? You endure. But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Don't think of it as strange, folks, when you are going through this life and you are nose to nose with somebody that's not treating you fairly. Maybe they're mistreating you. And maybe some things that just doesn't make sense, and you wonder, how can I face this? And day after day, perhaps you face that injustice. And maybe, sometimes, we face the situation with bitterness and anger. And it really messes up our day, and it really messes up our life, and it really gets us off track of our pursuit of godliness and Christ-centered life. As we watch Jesus go through these trials, we can learn greatly. You know, Jesus never allowed bitterness and anger to control his life. He was in perfect control, but what he did do is submit to the will of the Father. You see, he could have instantly taken care of the problem. He could have blew those people off the face of the earth with just a thought. He could have delivered himself by legions of angels. He could have alleviated this whole thing, but he surrendered his life to the will of the Father. He never allowed the bitterness and anger to control his life, to get him off track of the focus of what he needed to do. In the same way, we ourselves need to be in the same pursuit. Regardless of how we are treated in this world, we need not to allow bitterness and anger to control our lives, but continue to surrender to the will of the Father. You know, in these situations here, as we come around the table this morning, and we gather around the table, and this is a significant thing that we do here. This is a time when we remember Christ. We remember the sufferings that he went through, all because of the sin that has tainted our lives, controlled our lives, and we need a Savior. We must have a Savior, someone to pay the price of our sin. And Jesus will go on to do that. And Jesus himself, in that upper room, he established this ordinance to his followers. Something that they could remember him by. This stuff that you see in front of us, we call elements. Nothing magical about it. They just bought it at the grocery store. It's just grape juice. It's just crackers. But yet the very symbol of it, of these elements, causes us to remember the body and the blood that was given on our behalf. And Jesus wants us to do it regularly.